First, I want to thank you for honoring people who are close to the world. Having this footstool right here. I'm going to tell you, this is some kind of something right here, having this. No, oh yeah, and the vocalist in me is thinking about this mic also, and the preacher in me about the song. You all set me up just right. Thank you, Dr. Bridgman. And thank you, President Rundell, and my dear friend, Reverend F. Willis Johnson, Kyle Brooks, and to others who are here. I see Dr. Alston here. And just thank you, Songbird. Thank you all for your presence here today. I bring you greetings from Chi-Town. I think the temperature right now may be about similar to the temperature here today, so thank you all for the setup. I'm very happy to be with you right now. I'm happy to present my thoughts as disconnected as they feel to me. Any of you that have done, written and worked on projects, every student here understands the disconnect when it comes to writing about a subject matter. You just don't feel like you got all the pieces in place. And if you had more time, you would make many, many changes. This is the way of writing. It's the life of the mind. And I'm in the thick of it right now. So in some ways, what I'm sharing with you today are my reflections towards a publication. In my own way, I like to play around with what I'm writing. I like to play around even in lectures. Play is an important aspect of my life, and it keeps me thriving. So if you hear a little humor, it's just, blame my daddy. I got it from my daddy, And the other thing about what I'm sharing with you all today is that for some of you, this may be a subject matter, and the content may be something that triggers you, maybe something you just cannot deal with. And I respect that. I do, I respect it. But I feel like it's something I have to struggle with as a black woman, queer lesbian. It's something that I have to struggle with, and since I have to struggle with it, then I might as well write about it and try to wrestle with it on paper. And I love what the young adults say, the statement where they say, make it make sense. You make it make sense. So I'm trying to make some of the things that I'm seeing in life make sense for me. Dear Goddess, face up against the renewal of vows. Do not let me die a coward, Mother, nor forget how to sing, nor forget song. It's a part of mourning as light is part of sun. Having been diagnosed with breast cancer 6 years prior, black feminist author and activist Audre Lorde writes these words not many days after being told that the cancer has possibly metastasized to the liver. A brilliant, brilliant lesbian poet. Lorde's choice of words are not happenstance, but convey pain, determination, resolve, and even acceptance. Reading through the collection of her unpublished writings, comprised of sections of her personal journal published after her death, I'm amazed by how much she suffered, and yet she kept her very busy speaking and writing schedule. Let me just say another thing. I'm always honored to be able to sort of peer into people's lives after they pass by way of their journals in Archive 6. This is the kind of stuff we do as researchers. And yet at the same time, it just always shakes me that we're reading words that they probably never imagined such a huge amount of people would be poring over. I'm amazed at her, at just how she kept up, and I resist the temptation today to pick her words apart, to do that sort of deep analysis as we theologians often do, somewhat like Sunday school teachers or Cal Pentecostal preachers in the midst of a thunderous sermon. Read! Where every part of a scripture, every layer of every word in that one sentence text has some unrevealed meaning that only they can bring to surface. Read! No, for this time, Lord's words must rest on the page for our eyes to see, to behold, to affirm as part of the human condition which we all understand. Indeed, we understand her words because we are all subject to this journey. We are all. As my father told me on the occasion of my mother's death, in the year before he too would die, he said, "Baby, we all have to go that way. We come in this world dying, and we all have to go that way." As a minister of the gospel, I've seen that I've seen it way too many times. Parishioners have invited me to walk with them or their loved ones as they travel their final days of life in this dimension. I've tried to honor with dignity and respect those occasions, having walked the several routes, highways, and integrated network of pathways that lead to death. My mother died of breast cancer when I was in my early 20s. She was only 48 years old. She fought so very hard to live, and yet I watched, believing in a futile effort, hoping, as most loved ones do, that her suffering would not last long. My sister closed her eyes at 49, having fought the same illness. And the older I get, the greater the frequency of death visitations. If you live long enough, the greater this frequency, the greater this visitation of death. So this two-part lecture flows from my reflections about faith and about my father's words about death, all from my perspective as a queer lesbian African American. What I have to say is not so much where I have landed, but I hope you will hear how I am wrestling with what it means to be human, what it means to live. Today I'm sort of bookending my thoughts between a theology of death, a theology of the sacraments, with the in-between content set forth as the conceptualizations of life itself. Let me say that it's not my desire to dichotomize any one of these subjects, since I see them all as essential to one another. I hope to convey that we need death in order to live. We need death in order to live, and we need hope in order to survive, in order to die, We need death in order to live, and we need hope in order to die, or at the very least to accept death. And for the Christian, we need the sacraments to remind us that death does not have the final say. Rather than this being somewhat of a march towards death, we shall begin with death itself.
Today is not the day. Well, I can't just sit here staring death in her face, blinking and asking for a new name with which to greet her. I am not afraid to say, unembellished, I am dying. But I do not want to do it while looking the other way. Today is not the day. It could be, but it is not.
I'm finishing this piece of my bargain. And what I mean by that is it doesn't matter how long it takes to finish it, I don't know. But that is the shape of where I am living and functioning. And that I'm going on to something else, the shape of which I have no idea. Only thing I know is it's going to be quite different. What I leave behind has a life of its own. I've said this about poetry. I've said it about children. Well, in a sense, I'm saying it about the very artifact of who I have been.
A systematic theological account of death must allow for the possibility that death is itself something. One might say almost contradictory that something is a type of abyss, not nothingness, but a negation, if you will, of the living, and yes, a completion of this phase of life. Though some, like Ambrose of Milan, have drawn from the Pauline epistle in Philippians, which says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain," in order to advance a duality of body, soul, and to argue for spiritually evolved life, evoking a kind of separation for the material and the carnal. You know, the Pentecostal church, we talk about being otherworldly and fleshly. As an African American, I'm hard-pressed to agree with Ambrose that we should, in his words, and I quote, have a daily familiarity with death, a daily desire for death. Even given the symbolic and mystical tenor of his technique, I'm too influenced by the struggles for liberation, too influenced by Dolores Williams to embrace this Christ, this surrogate God, this example of unmerited suffering and sacrifice at the hands of evil persons, this never said a mumbling word, as a mechanism of salvation. Black people, especially Black LGBTQI persons, have borne too long the wretchedness that is oppression to gladly suffer for the sake of some reward in the afterlife, the afterwhile, by and by. Thank you. Neither can I support Ambrose's theology of death that encourages us to be exiles from our own body, so as not to be exiles from Christ. To agree with that would diminish the fight for life of my ancestors, who held on to every ounce of life despite the torture they endured against the body. Indeed, they understood their bodies as life-giving, as embodied vessels, as vessels holding free souls. They fought against the death of enslavement. Before I be a slave, I be buried in my grave. That Black radical tradition of thought was the type that was willing to fight for life, fight to be free against free agents of their lives, and only when that was not possible would death be an acceptable option. Well, it comes back up for you. Unlike Ambrosian thought, the body was not understood as a burden of the soul, something to be escaped from. The quotidian toil of slavery, the everyday toil of slavery, was the primary burden and suffering which needed to be escaped and even transcended via the mind. This is why I argue that death comes to us as daily anxiety. We know it awaits us, but we would rather not dwell on that. Better to focus on life, eh? I'm convinced that it is with us, that death is with us, not as a surge of daily anxiety, but as a daily type of keenness about the ultimate fate of our bodies. We're dying. There, I said it. Us dying. If this is dying, if this is in fact dying, if dying is a daily keenness about our fate, then the survival and thriving of oppressed persons across our world is not, as often is requested, is not a theological treasure trove filled with lessons to be co-opted by oppressors, or lessons to be stolen and packaged as motivational speeches for audiences of privileged pretenders of solidarity. If dying is a daily keenness about our fate, then ought we not sit humbly with our own mortality and learn the lessons of how truly ill-equipped we are to travel the journey from life to death alone? When we allow death to confront us and affront us, even death in mystery, it makes us also confront our human existence and the interdependency of our lives. The interdependency of our lives. Was this not, in fact, Heidegger's point? Okay. The lyrics of a contemporary black gospel tune written by Hezekiah Walker and sung often during Sunday morning worship so much I get tired of hearing it sometimes. The song sung as a way to welcome visitors illumines quite well my sentiments about interdependency. I need you. You need me. We are all a part of God's body. And it ends with this frame: you are important to me. This sentence, 4 sentences, 4 words. I need you, 5, to survive. I need you to survive. The interdependency. The sense of our own mortality reminds us to live. To live is to recognize our futile struggle for immortality and our dependence on a world outside of ourselves. I need you to live, in fact. The everyday anxiety of death gives us the occasion to live. It reminds us that our days cannot be counted. So those who live life well do so having accepted death's certainty, life's uncertainty, all while treasuring the present reality and the potentiality that is to come, if we but live until we die. We need death in order to live, because its presence has the capacity to remind us to do better and be better. That is, unless we are of the highest order of narcissism and greed. We have a supreme example of that, and that's another conversation. has all this to do with the lives of LGBTQ people? What does it have to do with black lesbians, bisexuals, trans women, and black queer women? Surely we have and do bear the brunt of a type of alienation and oppression from within and outside our own communities. Like most humans, we have accepted our own mortality, and yet the opportunity to survive and thrive is threatened by the very nature of our tripartite existence. We are black, women, and LGBTQ. We die at the hands of those who fear life, who fear love, who fear their own passions. We are hated by human beings who believe their whiteness makes them more human, superior to black and brown people, unable to understand that they have swallowed the poison of this myth which has robbed them of life abundantly, given them a premature death even. We black LGBTQ persons have often had to face our own mortality in the struggle for our liberation. Many of us have often jumped in the proverbial river. The water was cold, chilled our bodies, but not our souls. And here, if this were playing, I would remind you of that great scene in the new movie, Harriet Tubman, where Mente jumps off the bridge, and her body is, she comes up on the other side, having decided that she'd be free or die. Decades of rising from the grip of oppression and death, black LGBTQ persons are intimate with dying and pragmatists about the possibility of death much earlier than the biblical 70 years. A theology that takes into account the ways we live towards death is an important and necessary endeavor, especially because it requires some conversation about the human body. And it is not the human body, is not the human body, especially what is done with the human body, the primary focus of those who hope to exclude LGBTQ persons from the life of the church in similar ways that racists hope to exclude black people from the life of the church. As I think about dying and I think about death, I've also been pondering, really sort of deeply thinking about black bodies, not about how black people behave or think, but how the very presence of black bodies changes the atmosphere of a room, a neighborhood, a town. How the presence of black bodies is understood as a threat to life itself. A few years back, I was on my way to a conference, and I began to read an article written for Sojourners magazine by Rob Schneck about Christians and gun ownership. I want you to listen to the first paragraph of this article because I think it's an exquisite example of what I'm trying to get at when I talk about black bodies and changing space and black bodies seen as a threat. Schneck wrote this: sitting at a dining room table full of fellow evangelical pastors, I asked how many were carrying. Now that's a euphemism for how many are carrying a gun. And they all raised their hands. Then I asked, what determines when you draw your gun and prepare to shoot another human being? There was awkward bodily language and mumbling. After a few seconds passed, one older man said, I'll tell you what determines whether I draw the gun or not. It's the man's skin color. I was left speechless by the pastor's jarring, blatant racism. The pastors jarring blatant racism. Still, as respectfully as possible, I asked him to please clarify what he meant. Well, he said, we got a big city nearby, and you know the black people there are always killing people. Now, if a colored man comes into this county, I know he means trouble because he knows he doesn't belong here. That makes him more dangerous than a white man. That's why I pulled my gun. End quote. Notwithstanding the fact that this article reveals the depth and virulence of racism, but more relevant for our reflection is the idea that merely the presence of a black man is understood as evil at hand, is understood as not permitted in white space, is a threat to whiteness, and therefore, without interrogation, warranting guns being drawn. While much of our outcry has been about excessive police force against unarmed black persons and the expected outrage, as we've had to witness numerous field accounts of their murders, I am desirous in this writing of therefore pushing for more reflection on the established boundaries, the real and perceived, that dictate where our living bodies belong. To wit, how our very embodied lives are therefore a threat to other lives, and much more importantly, why that perceived threat must somehow be understood as a motivation to advance towards death. Okay. Excuse me. My aim in this regard is not only about a theology of death, but a discourse on the stigmatization, the villainization, and the regulating of human bodies in particular spaces, and how that oppression heightens the ever-present anxiety of death. Such a discourse for LGBTQ bodies must problematize not only secular space, but if it is to be efficacious, problematize the institutions that espouse harmful theology, the very spaces, the very places where children suck from the engorged nipples of white supremacy and bigotry. Now, perhaps the most precise undertaking is the question, for me, normative spatiality in life itself in light of heterosexual hegemony. Can we even say that those spaces that are so oppressive as to harm beings is in fact a livable and living space? I would argue that these oppressive spaces are in fact already dead. To wit, I am arguing for the need to question the authenticity, the life of spaces that presume and demand the complete barring of all but the dominant group. Well, now that is a dangerous question precisely because it prompts us to address not only the limitations on spaces for black bodies, but the shutting off, politicizing, and checkpointing of spaces against blacks, women, disabled, and LGBTQ persons, because these bodies are perceived as a threat to normativity. From an ecclesiological perspective, the damage that is being inflicted on these members of the collective body, indeed the exclusion of these parts of the body of Christ, is a death wound to the institutional church. We see this on full display in my beloved denomination, the United Methodist Church. It is a wound that is older than each one of us gathered here today. This wound, in terms of Methodism, dates back to slavery. Was festered during the civil and women's rights movement, and is now so malignant that many are praying for a miracle for the healing of the denomination. Now, I think it's a misplaced prayer, but that's another conversation. We'll come to a place where we must let die that which cannot be healed. Dying towards letting die. The institutional church will die. In the case of the United Methodist Church, that death is inevitable. And I dare say that it may well be necessary in order for that which is viable to live. We are dying towards a life, a presence in this world that will hopefully embrace the hard lessons learned about how bigotry destroys. To move towards this newness demands sacrifice. It demands letting go. It demands risking all that we have accumulated. It even demands we question and even let go of heretofore conceptualizations of what really is sacred. To question socially constituted sacred sites where marginalized bodies may not enter or may enter only under additional systems of oppression is a necessary work for us all. This work, to quote Ella Baker, is bigger than a hamburger. Our work is now expanded beyond lunch counters, bridges, and schools, from the church to the bathroom, from the streets to the White House, from America to the global world. No sector of American life is off limits for interrogation and protest, you see. To live our lives amidst the anxiety of death, to be free in this living requires a mindset towards resistance to the oppression that does kill our souls, does kill our spirits much quicker than the event of death that marks the end of the life in this body. Lastly, and perhaps all too briefly, I want to set us up for what I'm conjuring, Valerie, for our time together this evening. Audre Lorde also wrote these words as she was struggling with her own mortality. Listen. In these loneliest of places, I examine every decision I make within the light of what I've learned about myself and that self-destructiveness implanted inside of me by racism and sexism and the circumstances of my life as a black woman. Survival isn't some theory operating in a vacuum. It's a matter of my everyday living and making decisions. That's survival. Every day. Tonight, I'm going to set us up for tonight. Tonight I will address LGBTQ survival and thriving in terms of the decisions we have made during the events of LGBTQ liberation, not necessarily as a contemporary ecumenical frame, but in light of the decisions that we made about how we want to live our lives within our churches. In the lecture this evening, Soul Tending Amidst Body Snatchers, I'm going to be dealing with, specifically, with sacred rights, R-I-T-E-S, the sacred rights of the church, vis-a-vis human rights, R-I-G-H-T-S. Now, I'm somewhat certain that one of the holiest places for LGBTQ persons is the sacred space that calls them people of sacred worth, but does not allow them the benefit of being received as full members with access to the full rights, R-I-T-E-S, of the church, unless they assent to a type of assimilation and confirmation. How do we tend to our souls within bodies that have been digested, have internalized so much of what, as Lord has said, of that destructiveness that is implanted by racism, sexism, etc., etc., etc. I hope you'll stay with me for the journey. Thank you all.
Stay right here. It is 1:50. If you have a 2 o'clock class and need to leave, I'm going to give you a moment. For those of you who want to stay, my class included, and have questions, you may stay. If you have a 2 o'clock class and need to leave, this is the moment. God go with you.
Bless you.
Come back at 7, though. So I want to reclaim some of the time we lost while we were trying to set up. And so if you have questions, this is the time that you might reflect. Those of you who are leaving, if you have questions tonight, bring them back. From what you heard, things you are troubled by, things you're fascinated by, anything that you want to. I just want you to know you just helped my Job commentary.
Oh, okay.
Now I have to go get the cancer journals. I got it in my office for Audrey Lord.
Thank you. See, we womanists, we do that. We help one another. Bless you.
Hello, my name is Bonnie Massey.
Bonnie.
Thank you for coming. You ended by saying that survival exists or includes everyday living and decisions. And I was wondering if you could give us examples of everyday decisions that you make that you feel like helps promote your survival.
I actually think my decision to get up out of the bed in the morning, especially given all the things that are going on in our nation. I'm going to limit it to our nation. It takes sheer will, I think, for black and brown people to leave their homes. That's a decision they have to make. And they recognize that even in leaving their homes, they may not survive the 24-hour day.
Given the timing of the lecture and everything, I was just wondering, but as you spoke, since we just had All Saints Sunday, how this idea of dying ties into the communion of saints idea we find both in history and theology, specifically through your lens that you bring.
Oh, I hadn't thought of Dios los Muertos. I think I'm pronouncing this right. Thank you. I hadn't thought of it as I was writing the lecture, and so I thank you for that. Surely there can be connections made. I think the most beautiful thing about that day is that it is in fact a celebration. It is not a casting aside the reality of death, but it is a celebration of those who have lived. And so I think in some ways what I'm doing with this writing is trying to celebrate not just one life, but the fact that we all are breathing. And what I'm trying to do is also to not limit life. You hear hints of it, to not limit life to this dimension. So I talk about this dimension of life. And I think that has to do with, in some ways, with how I was raised as a black woman in America. that the elders remain with us, and that there is another dimension that the eye cannot see, and that we indeed need to respect that other dimension.
I'm not a Methodist, but
That might be your one gift on this day.
I told Jay and the West Virginian guy, I said there's just certain levels of violence I'm just not willing to subject myself to.
Yes, I understand.
But my question is, in thinking about the death of the institution, the necessary death of the institution of the church, I'm thinking kind of two questions, because there's death that comes unexpectedly and comes very quickly, and then there's death that's a longer process. So it's kind of a question of, one, how do we facilitate death of the institution, and is it something that is it an invitation to the oppressors? Is it an invitation to come into that process, or is it just like, this is something that's gonna happen and it's gonna come quickly? So how do we help facilitate that process of that death? And then I guess who gets included? Is it an invitation for people to be a part of that?
So I don't know that human beings can actually facilitate death. My perspective about death is that it's a sort of nothingness that we can't really put our fingers on. It has no material form. We see its effects. Okay, I think as human beings we can be negligent. Okay, and our negligence may or may not facilitate it. There are people people tell you don't smoke, and yet people continue to smoke and live. So there's a mystery. There's some sort of mystery in you can't, I guess one can't advance it if you go a step in front of a train. You're mighty bold. But I'm not reflecting on death in terms of linear or in terms of time. I'm reflecting on death as an everyday anxiety, that it is what it is not in some sense, negation. In terms of institutions, particularly churches, I think this is the Pentecostal. I grew, my formative years were in the Pentecostal church, so that does come forth. I think materially there is nothing that is in this dimension of life that is infinite. So it all comes to a conclusion. What happens after that is a mystery for me. As far as the institutional church is concerned, I don't know that humanity of its own is advancing that ending for the institutional church. I'm spiritual, so I think there's a lot of the spirit world and the ways in which humanity is embracing evil, okay, is embracing evil that causes other human beings to say, this evil must end. And in order for the evil to end, then we need another manifestation of the church triumphant. We need to let this go. You follow where I'm going with that? Okay. Yes, I see your hand. These are great questions.
So thank you first. And I wanted to ask, when you're speaking of your Pentecostal background and how that informs your work, I read an article you wrote, I think it was entitled Reconciliation, in which you spoke about some of the limitations of the white liberal tradition in the United States. And I was wondering, speaking from your spiritual background, do you think there's a space for the American Christian movement to reclaim the idea of spiritual warfare from the Pentecostal tradition? And what do you think that might look like?
don't know that we need to reclaim that. I think this idea of spiritual warfare is what is hurting the fundamentalist evangelical tradition. And I see it, it's this idea that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. You see how the Pentecostal church is still with me? I can still quote all these scriptures. We wrestle not with flesh and blood, but against principalities, against spiritual wickedness in high places. The fact that the conservative evangelicals see liberation, okay, as a spiritual evil that they must fight against, okay? And this is not just in this era of time, but, I mean, the fight for civil rights, so many liberation movements for justice are often seen as spiritual warfare. Now, they don't take it the full step, okay? They don't take it the full step nowadays, because the rest of that scripture talks about spiritual wickedness where? Thank you. In high places. So if they were to interrogate the fullness of what they say, then they would have to begin to think about what's going on in D.C. Of course, with that kind of twistedness, they would think about spiritual wickedness in high places in D.C. with the Democrats, okay? Where you get this deep state kind of narrative going on. I just don't think we need to embrace that. I think there is room enough in our lexicon, in the lexicon of liberation, okay, for us to cling to phrases that are more liberative for us, and at the same time maintain and reframe spirituality itself, okay? Spirituality that does not see this march towards saving souls as though they're notches and little stars on our divine bio, but a spirituality that tends to the embodied humans, that is all of us, the collective human world, in terms of us living together in mutuality. So that other it separates us from one another. The good against the bad. It's dualistic for me. Sure. Yeah.
So Dr. Lightsey, during your lecture, I couldn't help but think of how, with respect to contemporary culture, a television show like Pose deals with the fact of black, not only black death, but black queer lives in the face of the specter of death, particularly there through the threat of HIV, but also the threat, and thinking of particularly the character Candy, her sort of untimely death due to the work she has to take on to survive. And so I'm thinking about how, what it means for even in the death of institutions, how there's not an institutional space that gives them room to mourn her passing. They create this space in the chapel and build something that, even though institutional space isn't holding them, something about the practices or the praxis of church and being together sustains. And so I'm interested in what it means for the practices to be sustained even as the institution crumbles or goes to dust.
That's so rich. So we're about to vibe right here, you and I. Can I just add to that? I think what you're also pointing to is pneumatology, okay? And so I'm thinking Tilikian here, and ecstatic, the spirit as ecstatism, the spirit as not confined within an institution, but that the spirit is that which is touched upon every life. And if I go to predominantly black spaces, the ways that those of us who have been associated with the Christian Protestant tradition especially have been shaped and nurtured on the rituals of the church, so much so and with the support of the Holy Spirit, pneumatology here, that which we have been able to dip our fingers into walks with us outside the doors of the institutional church and is part of our lives wherever we go. So, you hear that song of the Pentecostal church, take the Lord along with you everywhere you go. That's really, that's what I see in those things imposed, is that they're taking the rituals of the church and that who is it, John and Bite? There's no division between the sacred and the secular. Wherever we are, that we make sacred space. Where sacred space has been denied us in the institution because we have been so touched by the Spirit, so dipped into that kind of aesthetic, that wherever we go, we can create that space. We must create that space for ourselves. I think that's a lesson also. I think it's a gift, but I also think it's a lesson to the broader world that always seeks to separate and dichotomize the things of the Spirit, as though the things of the Spirit only happen on Sunday, only happen in church space, and because they only happen in Sunday or they only happen in church space, we can deny you the spiritual if you don't do what we say do. You see what if you don't live with your bodies in ways that we say live with your body. Yes.
Your view on death, I think it echoes kind of the view from the early church. And throughout history, we've seen people have that view. But where do you think the church got the ideology that we think of death so morbid, or we're afraid of it as opposed to understanding its natural process of life and how it does help us to live better? So where did the thinking, where do you think it started? And then have you always felt that way, or did you have a moment that that you felt enlightened in that respect?
I think that's a brilliant question. When did we shift from death as a natural order to thinking about death as an evil also? Maybe it came to us during Enlightenment. I hear you, Dr. Bridgman. But I think maybe Enlightenment, as an African American, I was not raised, that kind of sensibility. There's several parts of me that, there's part of me that thinks, ooh, dead body, don't touch, don't beat, don't go there. But there's another part of me that's very much like my aunties. Cold breeze comes in the room. My auntie will say, "Hi, Ricky, how you doing? Y'all be quiet. So-and-so came in the room." I'm a complex being. I'm a complex soul. I'm a complex soul in that way. I tend to hold on to those things. And I think for me, that's a gift. That is a gift that has been able to overcome the ways in which white slave owners tried to beat out of black people a kind of beautiful spirituality. And so perhaps in my writing, what I'm trying to do is reclaim that and kind of peel back the layers of that. So I thank you for this question.
Dr. Lightsey, we appreciate the time you've taken to think through these questions. And I speak for myself, I look forward to what you're going to say tonight at 7. Try to be here on time. Bring your friends. Come 10 on a mule, as Dr. Renita Weems would say. And we'll see you at 7.